Welcome to the Well Prepared Life podcast, where we dive into the fundamentals of readiness for life's challenges, covering topics from personal responsibility to mental and physical preparedness and beyond. Let's forge resilience, nurture growth, and embrace responsibility on the journey to the well prepared life. Welcome to episode 6 of the Well Prepared Life podcast. Thank you for joining us. Today we have a very special guest, my wife, Tara. And Tara, I have her here because one of the things that she has researched in school and talked a lot about, and she's spent a lot of her own time, she's even taught on it in different environments, is this idea of worldview. Yep. And so she has a lot of experience, and I'm just lucky to be married to somebody that cares about these things in this way. And so Tara, to kind of start us off, the main question is what is worldview and why should people even care about it in the first place? Some people might have heard of it, but some people also probably don't even know, have never heard that term before.
Yeah, it's kind of sometimes seems like a big intellectual, your worldview, and it feels very in the clouds and abstract and not useful for your life. So when we say the term worldview, a lot of times the example that I like to use, there's two of them. One is a worldview is a mental map that helps you navigate the world. So it's just helpful for navigation. Another example that I like to use is one of a puzzle, and this is a bit more of a complex analogy, I think, but I think it works. Yeah. With a puzzle, you have multiple pieces. Mm-hmm. Each of these pieces can represent a belief that you have. So whether it's your belief in a God or not, or your belief around ethics, and all those pieces for you, they fit together into a puzzle, and they form a big coherent picture. And then you're using that picture to get to mix analogies. You can use that picture to navigate the world. But it's all these beliefs that come together, and they have to kind of form a system together. But part of why that's important is because when you don't know what you believe, you're not sure how to act. Or if we draw back on the map analogy, if I have a map and it's telling me that McDonald's is to my left, and then I look up and there's no McDonald's, I'm kind of lost because I'm going off of a map that doesn't actually line up with reality in the world. And now I'm not sure how to act because the beliefs that I've been having or the map that I'm using is not actually guiding me through life accurately. Yeah.
So the idea as far as when you don't know what you believe, you're not sure how to act. Let's try to think of what are some more areas where we see this come up, maybe in different hot topics that we see today.
Right.
Because I could see, just even trying to think through and process some of this, some examples that come to mind are a coexist sticker is probably a good one as far as you have all of these things that are competing beliefs, and it's we just need to go together. Well, it's how do you interact with that? That's maybe one example. Do you have others that maybe come to mind? It's hard to get specific sometimes with something that's so heavy
and that's
and
what I
philosophical.
struggle with, and that's why it seems like a big topic sometimes, even though there is real application. But I think sometimes too that's how hot topic do you want to get?
I don't think there's anything really off the table. So.
Okay. Because that's where I think you see even competing narratives around pro-choice and pro-life, for example. Yeah. Of there is there's almost this circular reasoning of, if I want women to have a choice, they need to be able to have full autonomy. And that's influenced by their worldview that says the highest thing of value is your autonomy, or that you
so what you said there is it's influenced by their worldview, and that is the highest thing, the highest value is autonomy. Yeah. And so I think that's something to point out, is that worldviews value different things differently. Is part of it is they have, basically, if you were to put it on a measurement metric, it'd be one worldview might value autonomy as the highest one. Right. Or it might value organization and peace as the highest thing. And where it's it's better to be, I think of Japan, where in Japan, it is much better to go with the flow. We just had a friend who's living in Japan right now. It's much better to not rock the boat.
Right. No conflict.
No conflict. Do things the way that they always have been done, even if it's not best. And where it's and you hear stories, some of people in Japan specifically, where they literally you just work. You work and work and work. And so they put a high value on work at the detriment to personal life and health.
Right.
And so it's that's one area where I think it's if some like he talked about a friend that he had, how he's wanting to follow Jesus
Mm-hmm.
and like seeking after him, but he also has all of these like religious, at the very least, religious adjacent practices that Japan, like to be Japanese is to practice these things.
Right.
And so he's like, how does he like handle that situation? And that's a
Yeah.
conflict of worldviews.
Right. And that's kind of like using that puzzle example of our friend's friend. He's got his one puzzle that paints a full picture of a Japanese worldview, and he's got another puzzle that paints a picture of like a Christian worldview.
Yeah.
And what he's trying to do is either stick the Japanese puzzle pieces into the Christian puzzle piece. And like those don't fit. And that's where he's feeling tension and not able to navigate properly because there's a distortion within his worldview and inconsistency. And it's because you're jamming this piece from a different worldview and you're borrowing that and you're trying to stick it into the one that you want, but it doesn't quite fit.
So we just had like these two examples of a Christian worldview, a Japanese worldview. What if somebody doesn't have like a specific, like I am this worldview?
Right, like they don't
this,
fit into like a camp.
like how is their puzzle not just a jumble of random pieces, or is it?
Sometimes it is, because I think we often form worldview by either osmosis or you can intentionally form it. I think you'd said, how do you form a worldview earlier? And it's like a lot of times we're kind of just handed a worldview
Yeah.
through the culture, and like research will show that like a worldview starts to form when you are 18 months old.
Yeah,
Which is
crazy.
insane. Like to be that, it stresses me out because I'm like, oh my gosh, my child's gonna start forming a worldview at 18 months. Like,
Yeah.
I better know everything. No. But yeah, so it's like your worldview starts to form that early. Doesn't mean you're like forever in that worldview, but it does mean that like you are handed things. The bigger word for that would be presuppositions. They're the beliefs that you have that underlie all of your other beliefs. And they're normally ones that you presuppose that you haven't had to think through because you just assume that as a fact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's where the nitty-gritty thing, or like, I don't know, the main framework of a worldview even comes from is those presuppositions. And that's where you can get in the big questions that a worldview answers.
Yeah. I was about to like what? Okay, so it's like we have this idea of like worldview. It's all the things that we believe. They shape how we look at the world. It's like how we make decisions, forms all that.
Right.
It's like how do we figure out what our worldview is? Like that's kind of the next question.
So that's like digging into those. What are the presuppositions? And most worldview like thinkers will boil it down to like 4 main questions.
Okay.
And those are kind of everything hangs on how you answer those 4 main questions.
Yeah, and those questions have like a big name that's associated with each of them, but then it's like also
I'll
like they
break
have
them all down.
like breakdowns for like how they work.
Yeah, well then there's 2 like primary ones that all those 4 questions feed into. So if I were to start with like the 2 primary questions that most people are after, one is called the cosmological question of what is the origin, the nature, and the destiny of the cosmos.
Okay.
Like of the world. Read cosmos as world.
Or even
Kind of
creation,
what's the
or, like,
point
all
of creation, of all of it.
like the universe, why does the universe exist in that?
Yeah. And what's like the role of it and what's the future of it.
Yeah.
And then how do I as a person fit into that? So that's the anthropological question of like what is the origin, the nature, the role, the destiny of man? And those are most people, whether they voice that or not, have that somewhere in the back of their mind of like, okay, what's the point?
Yeah, so
would be the very simple way of saying
like another way of
this.
putting it is like why does everything exist and why do I exist?
Yeah.
Kind of like, and like, or it's like why are we even here at all and what's my purpose?
Yeah.
Would be like and that's like a huge thing that people would talk about in a lot of different situations is like what's my purpose? And it's like, and what we find I feel like right now in a lot of our culture is you determine your purpose.
Right.
Like you figure it out. And
which is a lot of pressure when this is like a primary question of life.
yeah, it's like this, and it like shapes how you view the rest of your life. It's like that. So it's like you are determined with shaping everything, which is accurate to an extent. Like nobody else can I'm trying to figure out the precise correct way to say this in the sense of like other people influence and shape your worldview by like your parents and your family and the people you grew up around. Like you don't get to just choose not
but
to.
But at a
take
certain
that on.
age, you're responsible for kind of picking up the puzzle pieces and examining if they fit and saying, do I actually believe this or have I just presupposed that all my life?
Yeah. And this is like sometimes we get into this type of thing, but if you were to like put a random guess, how many people do you think in the US specifically actually take the time to like
Oh,
look at those
gosh.
puzzle pieces? And this is like totally guesswork. It's not like it was
I feel like it's
scientific.
got to be really low,
Yeah.
like under 10%
Yeah,
low.
and that's kind of what I've
And I think it's probably higher for those within like a religious organization
That's fair.
because you're more like belief is so central to most religions.
and I would
So
say
I feel like
I
that's
would say
probably
yes.
higher.
Also around amount like I would say among people that assign themselves to something.
Yeah.
So it's like I would say atheists who are
Right.
like devout is the wrong word, but
Any-
basically like proclaimed atheists.
Yeah.
That they're like,
Well, I mean, I would personally even categorize that as like it's a religion. It's not
Yeah.
organized religion.
Yeah.
But it's any system of belief
Mhm.
that you ascribe to. So the like preset ones that people fall into the box of like I associate with atheism or Christianity or Islam, like those are all, you know, I feel like you're more likely to be like, "Oh, I've taken the time to evaluate these."
yeah,
But anyone, well, I was about to say something I don't think I actually believe. But yeah,
Mhm.
I think the amount of people who've actually like probably looked at the puzzle pieces and said, "Do I believe this? Does this fit coherently with the world? Like, is it an accurate map that tells me where to go and the places on the map actually exist in real life?" Probably small.
yeah. And so you have these two primary questions of why does everything exist and what is my purpose?
Mhm.
Are we just stuck with like you got to figure that out from scratch? Are
Yep,
there
figure out the big ones.
or
on
are
there.
there ways that there are other questions that can help us answer those things?
Yeah, so there's 4 philosophical like subsidiary questions. The first would be the ontological question. So that's the question of origin of
Okay.
the primary, like not primary because that's reusing words, but like the question of origin of like where did I come from? That's a question a lot of people we've at least thought, you
Yeah.
know, in that conversation.
And that one, it's like as we've talked in like some of like I've also done some study on worldview and stuff. There are
Mhm.
really two options for that, right?
Yeah, it's really only like supernatural or natural.
Okay.
And I mean, like a primary example of that is like just whether it's an organized religion or not, like a God, a supernatural being or power created us, or like we're a product of like natural evolutionary process.
Yeah.
There's not really a whole lot of other options viable for that answer.
And while like those are the two major categories, I would say the natural process is like there's really just one way that we see that like people talk about that. We
Yeah.
don't see a lot of options in the natural process.
Yeah, and when I say options too, it's like sure that you could have an infinite amount, but like actual options that people like
Oh, yeah.
consider that like would sufficiently answer the question.
Yeah. Well, that's what I say as far as so in the natural side of things, really evolution's the only answer that I'm aware of that speaks to that natural
Mhm.
option. But in the supernatural, you kind of have like
There's a lot of different flavors.
there's flavors of that
Yeah.
in the sense of like 7-day literal day creation, a jumpstart process that God started the process of evolution.
Well, and
We
when you
see
say
where we get here.
supernatural, like I guess that
But that's
does
like-
play into ontology as far as origin. But even before the how, what is the process that created us? Of like who created us?
Okay, so that's more. It's
Mm-hmm.
like so the supernatural versus natural is more about like are we a random chance or
Yeah.
are we on purpose?
Is this just like a big bang that happened, or is there a designer behind all of this?
Okay.
So it's less about the like process, which how you answer. That's
Yeah.
why it's like preceding that is because how you answer this of whether it's a supernatural cause or a natural is gonna inform even how you think about like what's the process that supernatural being used or what's the natural process that was at play.
As I'm like looking at the notes, that actually kind of gets into the second question just a little bit
Yeah.
of like, so you have the initial origin as far as are you on purpose from a supernatural being or
Right.
are you by chance through natural processes? And then it's like, okay, well, if it is supernatural, what is your belief about that supernatural? Is it somebody like you have it here as far as like I'll kind of let you
You
get
trying the
into-
axiology question?
Yeah, so that's the next one is axiology.
Yeah.
what we have
So
in
that's
here.
the question of value.
Okay.
Of you're asking like, what is the most valuable thing
Okay.
in the world, in my life? And the categories for this tend to fall within a theistic axiology,
Okay.
a humanistic axiology, or materialistic axiology. So is the thing of highest value in all of the world God, which you're right, of if you answer supernatural, maybe not, you're more likely to say that there's a theistic you have a theistic
but
axiology.
like kind of what I was saying is like you could have kind of there's two main flavors of a theistic view of one it's the God that's involved and is there. Another one is the God in the sky that started
A
the things,
deistic.
but a deistic is just
Yeah.
they're there, but they're not involved.
Mm-hmm.
And I think like those are distinctions that we even see in that like supernatural element,
Right.
where it's like involved or not involved. Like, did they start it and leave
Yep.
it, or did they actually like are they a part of it
Yeah.
consistently?
But even then, that's still like, downstream from ontology of like what started this to begin with.
Yeah.
And then you get into the character of that supernatural being or the character or characteristics of the natural process.
Gotcha. So to start answering that ontological question, it's like, okay, we have this first natural, supernatural, and then it can get into much more detail
Oh,
as far as
absolutely.
like what you
Yeah.
believe about that.
Yep.
So axiology, so
Yeah.
there's three main
Yeah.
areas.
So theistic, I think we just covered of like that would be like that supernatural cause, or as a Christian you would answer like God is of the highest value.
So it's so axiology is what is the highest value.
Yeah, what is of ultimate value?
Okay,
is
what
kind
of
of
ultimate value? Okay.
what you might phrase that as.
And so theistic is like, okay, so God is supreme. So that would align with typically your religions that have a God.
Yeah.
Specifically, I would say your more monotheistic style religions
Right,
than
yeah.
your like polytheistic religions. But then you have the other ones, humanistic, materialistic. Talk about those.
Yeah, so humanistic, I think you'd see that like within a secular worldview of like me as a human, I am of ultimate value. Like I am all there is.
Yeah.
I am hot stuff. Like this is the end all be all as far as value. Like that's me.
Yeah, well, and that can determine like how you interact with so much of the world around you.
Yeah, it's crazy that like this is a basic underlying question that like how you answer this has just vast implications for the trajectory.
Because like just a quick example off the top, it's just between theistic and humanistic, where it's like if you are humanistic in your values, it encourages selfishness, almost like that, like that. If like Ayn Rand,
Well, it's like
type person, like type setup. Like I've like listened, like read a couple of her books, and like it's very much like you are the most important thing, and to value yourself above all else is the best and highest good.
Right.
And it's like that. Like a lot of people take that and they move towards like a libertarian thought as far as like that is the true libertarian thought, but when you go to a theistic, it's like when God is highest, the selfishness.
Yeah, what I want is not as important as what God wants if God is of more value than me.
Yeah.
And already you have a clash.
And so that's why it's like, just as far as like, as we both think more towards, I wouldn't say full out, but more towards like a libertarian political viewpoint, it's one of the conflicts I have with a lot of libertarians.
Right, yeah.
Is that like, I'm like, no, I don't agree. Like we do have a theistic worldview, and like I don't agree with the whole idea as far as like put man at the top, and that's you'll get the best thing every time.
Right.
So you got to have some type of guide.
I would say selfishness is not a good thing inherently, but that's because of how I answer these questions too.
Yeah. So theistic, humanistic, and then last one, materialistic.
Yeah, materialistic. You see this most in like Marxism.
Okay.
Of like if material things are of the highest value, that's why Marxism places such a high value on who owns the material things. But yeah, so the basic answer though, axiology would be if you're having a materialistic answer, it's material goods are of highest value.
Okay. Gotcha. And so what are these other two? So we have two more listed here. That
So you've got the epistemological question. So that is the question of like, how do I know what I know? Or like, what is true?
What is true? Okay. I think that's like, there's a, one of the, like there's like a study that's a biblical worldview based study called the Truth Project.
Right.
And one of the phrases that they have is kind of a catchphrase is, do you believe that what you believe is really real?
Yeah.
It's like, what is
It's that question of like,
truth?
What is really real?
Yeah.
And how do I know? So in the answers to this, it is more so like, what's the process by which I know what's really true? So you've got kind of three options for that. One would be through revelation, and that would be some outside source gave you the revelation that's how you know what you know. That's how you were given what's true. The other option would be through just reason, through sheer like human thought and rationalism.
And this is taking these to all their like base levels.
Yeah.
In the sense that like all that can be known by reason. Because like
because obviously they interact with each other.
That's how I was wondering.
Like
looking
it's
at
not
this
like
one.
like with this one, there are things. Like I would say, yeah, I can reason out things, but how do I know what's ultimately true?
Yeah, what do I measure my reason against?
Yeah, is my reason always correct, or if I believe revelation is how I really know what things are, like then my reason has to bow down to the revelation that I receive and line up. That's how I know what I know is true.
Yeah. And then last one was
is intuition. So this is like the person in me just knows intrinsically what's right. I think you probably see this more in a lot of like pantheist worldviews of like, I'm one with the world and the world's one with me, and I just instinctively know because the universe told me so. So I think that's probably less of a like more mainstream answer to that question, but like, you know, it's been visited before.
Well, I think where we see this a little bit is the whole, like where we see this actually more popularly is the whole like your truth is your truth, my truth is my truth. Where some of that's reason based.
Yeah.
But
it's probably a
I
mix.
think where the intuitional part of that comes in is the fact, like if it's reason,
Actually, yeah, you're so right. This is way more prevalent than I even just stated.
like because if it's reason based, then multiple
then you have to
people
provide reason and rational
and
thought.
multiple people should be able to come to the same types of reasons, and there would be consistency.
Yeah.
Versus with we each can believe what we want to believe. Everybody can believe what they want to believe, and that's true.
What's ultimately true is what I intuit, and it like doesn't have to match anything else. It's just what I feel.
Yeah, and so I think we see that a lot of places.
Oh yeah, absolutely. As you said that, I was like, oh my gosh, yeah, I just totally misspoke on that. That's actually a big driver, I think, in today's culture.
Yeah, and so people just go based off, because also like when we see a lot of like feelings based decisions and feelings based stuff where that's all feelings, intuition.
Yeah, it's not reason. It wasn't like, well, here's how I came to this conclusion and the rationality I have behind it. It's like, no, it just felt right.
Yeah, like reason would be like taking a like a Plato and Aristotle approach of like thinking through, making decisions.
Deductive and inductive process.
Versus like intuition would just be like, what do I think is right?
Right, yeah.
And like not really using any sources necessarily.
Right.
And so, so I think that's very prevalent. And it's like, I think kind of the question of that is like, what is the danger of like these? And we'll get more into this a little bit before we wrap up as far as some of the practical sides of this. But I think there is significant danger in both the reason, honestly, all of them in different ways. But the intuition one, I think, is the most prevalent one that we see. So what is like the danger of that one specifically?
The danger of having like an intuitional like epistemology.
Yeah.
I think that gives us just such shifting sand. I think if you have that type of epistemology, like from one day to another, truth changes. Like if I were to follow my intuition on everything, like, I don't know, some days if I were to take this to an extreme example of like some days when you make me mad, then I would have every right and it would be true for me to be able to be like, our marriage is done. Like, just because of how I feel. But then the next day I'd be like, no, this is fine. But like then our marriage is really up and down just based on how I feel. Yeah. And because I think that that's ultimate truth, which is how I feel. And then I'm acting on that. And then I think the danger of that too is just even as a person, you give yourself emotional whiplash of like, I'm just all over the place. And one moment this is true and the next this is true. And they contradict each other even. Because, like, what I feel from one time to the next, like, can contradict each other. So, yeah, I think it's really harmful to, like, you as a person. It's harmful to each other. Like, because in that extreme example of, like, I'm harming you every time I'm, like, following my feelings to the ultimate extreme.
It's like, how do you have any lasting friendships?
Right.
If, like, anytime somebody makes you upset, they're the worst person.
Yeah, and you cut off contact because you don't, conflict is bad.
Yeah, well, you say the cut off contact. Like, that's one of the things that is, it's on Reddit, so it's like I don't know how prevalent it is, but it's in a big, like Reddit's a pretty big group of people, like millions of people.
Right, yeah.
And there's consistent things there as far as if somebody does something that you don't like, cut them off.
Yeah.
And that's like advice that's given and then praised.
Yep.
And it's like, that's a terrible way to live.
Yeah.
Like as far as it places no value on, or very little
even
value
just personally and culturally, because then, you know, if you're just cutting your family members off, then like the family's starting to be affected like across the culture, and then social ties start to break down. And that's where you could get into the levels of application too for a worldview of like the civil social dynamic is one that's informed by your worldview. Yeah. Like that's an area of application of like even just this example of like an intuitional epistemology of like how I know what's true is based on what I feel. That impacts how you apply it to your relationships in the world. Yeah. So, yeah.
And so what's this? So we've talked about the first three. So just to recap, we have ontology, which is our origin as far as is it natural or supernatural?
Where did I come from?
Axiology, this is what's of the ultimate value and most importance. Epistemology, this is dealing with the idea as far as like how do you determine what is true.
Yep.
And then what's the last one?
The last one is teleology. So this is the teleological question, which has too many L's to try to pronounce quickly. So this is kind of the question of like, what is our destiny?
Okay.
And that's where even you can see how these four answer the like primary questions, because we ask like, what's the origin, the nature, the destiny. So these four kind of come together to form that. But teleology is, where am I headed? What's my like ultimate end?
Yeah.
Generally speaking, you also have two answers to this of either you have some sort of like supernatural outside of this world's destiny, like Christians would call that heaven, or you have like an earthly destiny of like the earth is all there is. There's nothing
Like
that
dust.
we're looking forward to. After you die, you just die. So a lot of the teleological question has a lot of implications for like after death, like is there an afterlife or not? And that's generally how people phrase the question too, right? Of like there is one or there isn't.
Well, and that can shape a lot of how you live, just as far as like, and it's fascinating to hear like people who would be more altruistic on the earth, like this life is all that there is, there's nothing else. The more altruistic one is like, well, I have limited time, I need to make the biggest impact possible,
Right.
so that other generations after me can experience that. And so that would be like the good thing. But then you have the more nihilistic approach of this life doesn't matter anyway. It just all disappears afterwards. I can do whatever I want.
Yeah, nothing
and
has lasting value.
Nothing
if
has lasting
you-
value.
yeah.
So I'll just do what I want. And like,
Yeah.
and I think that's like one of the practical outcomes of like a nihilistic
Yep.
type of, and that's like a type of worldview.
Yeah. Nihilism. Yeah.
Is like suicide. And people are like, why even try?
Right.
It doesn't mean anything anyway.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, another good example of like how your teleology would form things is like it's very applicable in like the governmental sphere.
Okay.
Because if you think that there's no afterlife, no like lasting impact from this, then the government needs to step in and kind of save the world, if you will, of like if there's no like redemption coming.
Okay.
So like from a Christian worldview perspective, there's a kingdom of God that's coming that will bring justice after this world ends. But if you don't believe that's coming and this world is all there is, then you should make the government make the world be as good as possible.
Like
So
equity.
utopia is like a big idea if you have a more like earthly teleology.
Yeah, we want utopia and equity.
Yeah.
And not equality. Like the brief, for those of you who haven't heard the difference between those, equality is like equal in value and equal in like treatment before the law, things like that. Equity is everybody gets the same result.
Yeah.
And so like the ultimate like view would be like we want to work as close to equity as possible with the, I would say, the unrealistic expectation that that equal result is the best of it for everybody.
Right.
When in reality,
yeah.
the equal result ends up being like not equal in the first place, but then also typically not good.
Right.
Like we
But
see
yeah,
that
it's
through
like-
history in different examples.
Yeah, and if this is all there is, then like we should try to make this as best as possible, like Earth as good as possible. And that's not to say that if you believe in an afterlife, you're like, well, whatever, I don't care about this
'cause-
world. Because depending on how you answer those questions and what you believe about the creator that you ascribe to, then it's like you have certain mandates. So like from a Christian worldview, it's like God gives a mandate to help cultivate cultures. But there is a knowledge of like this is not all there is. But if that's not on the table, then it's like we need to make heaven on earth because there is no heaven.
Yeah, well, and I think what we see in the Christian mandate, in the Christian worldview, is this: when people wrong me and harm me and do things against me, I don't need to get justice now because I will get justice and like things in
Right.
heaven. And that's like,
Yeah.
I would say, the proper view of like a Christian worldview, is that you can accept injustice
Yeah.
and you can move past it because you know that there's like going to be that justice and the like correct outpouring of that in the end.
It will be made right.
And so you
eventually.
can sacrifice,
Mhm.
you can like give up things that are good to
Right.
help other people, because you know in the end like that there is something on the other side that's better.
Right. So just that outlook alone impacts, again, how you live. So it's like these seem like big questions. And when you use the actual philosophical words with all the ologies, you're like, how does this actually impact my life?
Yeah.
But it's like when you talk like that, you're like, oh, if you have a view that says this is not all there is, like, oh, I actually live a life with like hope
Mm-hmm.
more than, in my opinion, like than I would if from like a nihilistic worldview.
Well,
you
it's
know?
like a nihilistic is literally like I would say almost literally is the absence of hope, just
Right.
specifically. But the element as far as like there's nothing after this life, I would even the more positive outlook on that, I'd really find it hard to like have hope in that situation, even when it's
Yeah.
more altruistic. And let's try to make it as good as we can,
Mm-hmm.
because there's the reality, and that's that from that viewpoint. You don't get to see, even if you put it in,
Yeah,
you
you
work
will
your whole
never
life
know
towards it.
if it was worth it.
Like even if you happen to live a good life, when you die, it's done.
Right.
And if you believe that, it's like,
That's kind of depressing.
yeah. And so that's kind of leads to, so those are the like the big areas.
Right.
So yeah, so what we have these questions, and what are some of the practical ways? Like one of the things that we talk about is there are some major like overarching worldviews that a lot of people fall under, typically based on religions, but not fully.
Right.
What are some of the big ways that people can start to identify what their worldview is? Like as
Yeah.
far as like they ask these questions, sure. But what are like typical answers that they might find? They're like, oh, if I believe this, I tend to align with that thing or this thing.
I'm not sure if I fully understand your question by this.
Well, as far as like the idea, as far as like the difference between like Buddhism and Christianity,
Mm-hmm.
in the sense of like if I believe, like Buddhism, they don't believe in a deity like, per se. It's like a
There's
theistic
a-
element
Yeah.
to it, but it's more of like nature is God. It's not quite
Getting into
pantheism.
Some pantheism.
There's some pantheism,
I
but
don't know
not
enough
fully.
about Buddhism.
Yeah.
Bad example to choose from.
But the idea of like you have kind of this natural reincarnation karma, like where do you go after you die? You reincarnate. Like that's answering that question.
Yeah.
So it's like if you believe that you are born into another being, body, life form after you die, if you believe in the idea of karma, that what you
Yeah.
do will bring things back to you. If you believe in those things, it's like, okay, well, you probably align with a Buddhist worldview versus like a Christian worldview, where it's like we believe that like the Bible is the source of truth, and we
Right.
believe in a theist who, like a God who created everything, and more specifically, who's involved and personal in
Right.
that, and it shapes how we live because of those things.
Right.
So I guess like looking at kind of some of the notes that we have here, what are some examples of like different worldviews and like the different distinctives of them?
Yeah. So, like, if you were to go, I think a good, more generic one to talk through sometimes is like a humanistic or secular worldview.
Okay.
All right. So, secular worldview is answering the question of ontology is like this is a natural ontology. Like, we're created by a natural evolutionary process. From there, I think a humanist would answer, they'd have a humanistic axiology. So, humans are of the highest value.
Mm-hmm.
And then their epistemology would be through reason of because I'm a human. A lot of times it can be intuition as well.
Yeah.
But the traditional humanism and rationalism tends to say reason
Yeah.
is how I know things. And then they'd have like an earthly destination because there's no supernatural, there's no life outside of this. So where you would see this play out would be like in politics would be one area that would be like progressivism tends to be the flavor that like a humanist would aspire to, because if there's no supernatural outside destination, then like you said, I want to make sure things progress here on earth, and I want to make sure that like my politics are progressing.
Well, and it comes from a belief, like when you go to a purely like humanist, non-theological, everything's here on accident, everything is amoral from the start.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing, like an individual is not good or bad.
Right.
And if you take the evolutionary approach, everything is getting better. That would be like the
Yeah.
evolution's perspective. So it's like
Right.
everything is getting better over time.
Yeah, we're advancing
We're
all
advancing,
the time. We're evolving.
And so we're doing that. And so one of the conclusions of that is like, and that most people would say, and a surprising number of like people with a biblical worldview would say, is like, is man basically good? And
Yeah.
they would say yes.
Yep.
And so that shapes like where it's like,
Well, and you would answer that because of your axiology. Is if your axiology, the thing that's of ultimate value is humans, then you have to say man is ultimately good
Yeah.
because they're of highest value. How could they be bad?
mm-hmm. And so it's like, so from there, you can then head into that progressive ideology because you're like, if man is basically good, then all we got to do is get the right circumstance involved.
Right.
We just got to build the right system, and then it's all going to work out.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's where like their view, like history from a secular, like humanist perspective would be like a social progress type of narrative, because like you said, if we're always progressing and evolving, then like the chain or the theme of history is progress. And like I think you had said in the area of like ethics, it'd be like moral relativism of there's not an inherent sinfulness or fallenness about me. Like what's good for you is good for me. Like if I can reason it out.
I mean, taken to its more extreme, there is no such thing as sin.
No.
Like as far as there is no good or bad action, there are things that help me and things that hurt me.
Yeah.
In the sense of like, and so and like the idea of like good and bad doesn't exist, but the idea of harm and like help is more what it's like based on. And so that's where it's like you even like going kind of back to that like libertarian like the NAP, non-aggression principle.
Right.
But where it's like that comes out of if humans are basically good and it's a harm versus help, then we just want to never do anything that harms people.
Yeah.
And that's if we do that, then we're going to be good.
Yep.
But if it harms anybody else, then that's bad.
Yeah.
And it's like that while that works in some situations, it does not work because like, well, from our worldview, it's like we have a worldview that like humans are not basically good.
Right.
That they, in fact, it's more surprising. I think C.S. Lewis put it. It's like we should be more surprised at that.
When
like there is as much good in the world as there is over like the fact that people aren't sinning everywhere every day.
Yeah, and that's where you would, if you want to compare the two, and even go to the world of politics. That's why Christians would generally fall throughout history have on the side of like checks and balances, because I don't believe humans are naturally good.
So
I believe they're inclined to sin. So they need a check in place to curb that natural desire to do wrong. So.
Yeah, so you need something as like a block from taking it to something that harms people.
As someone said, like G.K. Chesterton said that his quote was like, "What's the problem with the world? The problem is me." And like a Christian worldview is going to say the problem is me, but generally speaking, a secular worldview is going to say the problem is the system.
Yeah,
it's everything around me, and if I change that and I make the environment, it's kind of the argument of like nature versus nurture. Yeah. Like if the environment is more nurturing, then I can be better, and then we won't deal with all these issues in the world. So that's where even you'd see politics vary. Of if Christians are saying sin is a problem, the political diagnosis is not going to be more government programs and intervention necessarily. Like there are people, I'm not saying everyone believes this, but you're more likely to say that we also need to own that people are also part of the problem as much as they can be part of the solution. Yeah. So we also need to own that. Whereas a more like secular worldview might say, well, then we should have an outside force come in and fix those problems instead of also taking ownership of them.
It's like change the system, everything's going to be okay.
Yeah.
And so I think we've pretty well described like what is a worldview and how do you go about the process. It's a long process to do this, to really think through it in depth. But how do you start that process of determining what is my worldview? And so now what is the like practical application of this, as far as like we talked about this puzzle, and when things don't miss, we try to fit like other puzzle pieces in like one worldview doesn't fit in another worldview.
Can I back us up just real quick as far as figuring out like what is my worldview?
Yeah.
If I were to give someone categories to view, like to get them starting to think about like what is my worldview? How do I answer these? I would say look at how you're evaluating like the various spheres, if you will, in the world. So like the civil social, what are you saying about like how should things be run in relationship between other people? I think and
it's really into the why behind that. Like, why do you think it should be run this way?
What's the question that I answered in a certain way that indicates how I answered why I think the civil social should be set up in the structure? Education would be another one. Yeah. So, like, what are your beliefs around education, around, like, ecclesiology, so that'd be, like, the church, around, like, legal systems, economic systems, around art even, of, like, what do you think is beautiful?
Yeah.
Because that, like, obviously our axiology influences what you think is beautiful. What do you think, aesthetics are about?
Yeah.
And that's where you've even seen shifts in art throughout history as worldviews change, which is actually kind of cool. But, there's various artists who highlight man more than they highlight. And then now a lot of art sometimes highlights material thing. And that's how you just see a shift in axiology even.
Yeah.
But yeah, so those would be the big ones. I think I hit
No,
all
I
of
think
them.
that's helpful.
Yeah. Of like, just look at the various areas of your life that you're already like living in and involved in, and
Yeah.
those can help clue you in.
Awesome. And so, yeah, so getting this down from like, we've been at like, I would say like the 30,000 foot view
Yeah.
of like really thinking through like, what is the big picture of worldview?
Right.
Like one of the ideas that I believe and the things that I like live by is that our worldview impacts how we stand up to different things. And I've said even before, I think in other podcasts, and if not, I'm saying it now, of your worldview determines how well you can stand up at what the world throws to what the world throws at you.
Yeah.
And it impacts how you respond to hardship and
Right.
trial. And so, like,
Well, that's actually a criteria for something to be a worldview. So a lot of times there's a reason why there's like this X worldview and Y worldview. It's because it has to fit some criteria. It can't just be like whatever you want.
okay, that's helpful. So a worldview can't, like, so I said earlier, as far as like what keeps people from having this random
Yeah.
hodgepodge of ideas. It's like, well, because it doesn't actually qualify to be a worldview.
Right. There's flavors at times,
Yeah.
but it's like I think a funny example I used at one time was the Pastafarians.
Oh yeah.
Of like they believe that like the spaghetti monster created us, and like the highest value is if you like wear pasta strainers on your head, and then I forget, but it was just like a stupid example. And like the moral life that you live is by like eating as much pasta as you can. Okay, well, why is that not a worldview most people ascribe to? Like, why is that not actually on the
Seems
menu
crazy.
of?
Like you look at it and
Because
like,
it is crazy.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And that's where it's like it doesn't quite fit the criteria of to be a worldview. It needs to be universally applicable.
Okay.
So like I can't pick and choose when I want this to apply. Like
Okay.
I am kind of beholden to these ideas, and like they have to stand up to reality. Like they have to apply to the world. And then it has to provide like lasting answers. It can't just be like I answered this one time and now it doesn't really hold up 3 weeks later.
Yeah.
Like that's part of what I got into. Like if it's shifting all the time, that's so, I don't know, it's harmful to you
Mm-hmm.
and to the world. But like it can't be always shifting. It has to be like lasting.
Yeah, well, it's like from those first two, as far as lasting, and it has to match with reality.
Yeah.
It's like even just with those two alone, there's elements as far as like, you in order to be ready for different things that life throws at you, you have to like have a firm foundation.
Yeah.
Like you use the analogy of shifting channel. What's the antithesis of that is firmness
Right.
and like firm foundations.
Yep.
And so it's like, so if what you're standing on is shifting, you obviously are not going to be able to stand up well. But if what you're standing on is firm, then you have much better opportunity and chance of standing up well.
And the reason worldviews have crumbled in on themselves is generally when reality places too much of a burden on that worldview for it to hold up against. So something in real life needs an answer to answer, like it requires a response. And if your worldview is not big enough and it doesn't have a lasting answer, your worldview is crumbling because it doesn't support the reality and the big thing that you're actually facing.
Well, it's like, yeah, with this idea as far as like, why are we here? And why does any of this matter?
Yeah.
And if you don't have a good answer to that, and something like if there's a tragedy, like a close friend dies, then you're like, well, if my life was based on my relationship, like a spouse, to take like your closest relationship, like I could find it very easy to like sympathize with somebody where it's like I based my life around this person and they're gone now, and I don't know how to live on. And so it's like I think that is at least in some situations, maybe a lot, but in some situations, something similar to that is what leads to like an example of a collapse. The outcome of a collapse of worldview is suicide.
Yeah.
I would say in most situations that suicide happens, it comes from their worldview didn't hold up.
Right.
And they couldn't process.
Yep.
They didn't understand enough why something was happening. And that's not to, I want to be very careful. Like that's not to say that like people with like actual like chemical imbalances and illness.
And that's not to victim shame either.
It's not to say that
it's tragic when that happens. Yeah.
Because like my hope and goal and like desire would be for those people to have something that is firm, not to be like, well, they just weren't strong enough. No,
Right.
It's that they like my wish is that those people had something they could be like, this is the worst thing that could happen,
Yeah.
but I still have reason to live.
Right. They're equipped enough to be able to face those trials and not just give up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you talked about those two things. Are there any other elements where that falls out as far as like the matches to reality and it's lasting?
Those are the two big ones. Yeah.
Okay.
The biggest ones. I think there's one more that I can't remember off the top of my head,
problem.
I think. But that's like the main meat of it. Of like it has to be universally applicable. So like this has to be as true for us right now as it was for someone 300,
Yeah.
2,000 years ago. And it needs to be still true in the future.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I mean, like lasting and universally applicable.
Yeah. So it's not just universal in the sense of like, well, I mean, in the sense of like it applies to, I think we sometimes minimize the word universal. That's what
Right,
happens in
yeah.
my mind right now. We're like trying to make this thing as far as, I'm like, no, if you actually take it at face value,
Mm-hmm.
universal is everything,
Yeah.
both in time and space.
Mm-hmm.
And so from there,
Mm-hmm.
so it's like those where like the criteria we have for our worldview, the impact that it has. What's like one thing somebody can do this week to like make a step forward in this category? I know it's a
Mm-hmm.
massive thing, and so I want to give something that's like bite size,
Yeah.
especially for people that haven't thought about it. And maybe what's one thing they can do, and that's one resource that you would recommend for somebody wanting to learn more about this and dive into it.
Yeah. My problem is I sometimes go like way too deep into I'm like, here are 7 books that you should read.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think I'll start with a resource because that's easier for me to think through.
Yeah.
There's 2 main books I would reference. You could get one or the other. It's not like you have to read both.
Yeah.
But a good like primer on it would be, it's called Prevailing Worldviews by, I want to say Steve. No, it's not Steve. His last name is Martin. I have the book with me, actually. Hold on.
Okay, that's the one you have with you. Okay.
Glenn Martin, Prevailing Worldviews. So what's helpful is like it explains what a worldview is, but then also shows examples of it throughout history. So that's really cool. And it's like not as long or like it's not a textbook.
Yeah, as you guys saw, like you physically held the book
Yeah.
there. It's a normal size book.
It's a normal size book. And then one that's like it'd be a larger book, but it gets into like world religions and like comparing a bunch of different belief systems is called Understanding the Times by David Noble.
Okay.
And that's more of a textbook.
Yeah.
But it's like helpful. There's even like a chart within it of like here's all of the main religions and here's even just like a quick category of what that religion or worldview would say about, like it's not exclusively religions.
Yeah.
It's got secular and it's got Marxism and stuff like that. But it'd be like, here's what they'd say about like our beliefs about biology and ethics and history and law and all of that. Economics, all of that.
Yeah.
So those are resources. As far as something that someone could do this week, honestly, I think a spot that I would start. Well, one question I would have for someone is like, if you were to box your worldview?
Yeah.
Like for you, I'd be like, what would you say your worldview is?
Yeah, it's like, so I would say, like, I have a biblical Christian worldview.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then I would get into what does that worldview say about those 4 questions?
Yeah.
Because it's not like starting from scratch of anything is really hard.
Yeah.
But if you can line it up to like, all right, what am I saying I believe versus what I actually believe versus what I want to believe.
Well, and this is where I think it comes back to the idea of how our epistemology. Is it revelation, reason, intuition? Because that shapes like where you start
Right.
for this. And so from like a revelation perspective, you're kind of determining right off the bat if you're like, I believe that something else
Yeah.
determines
That's
truth.
a good starting point this week. Yeah.
That at the right off the bat, you're saying, okay, there's some supernatural being that is determining what truth is.
Right.
So
that is revealed
if you
to me.
aren't religious at all or you don't follow this, but you believe there's a supernatural thing, you are immediately saying, okay, I got to pick one of these religions or a religion of some type. Like,
Right.
and so it's like studying religions, learning about that could be it. And then like reason would be like, do you actually like reason things out?
Yeah. Well, I will say too with revelation, like you can say revelation in creation too.
Yeah.
So that's, an option.
Which we believe.
But
2 elements in that.
to an element, but not as the single
Yes.
point of truth. But sorry, that might muddy the water more
But
than
yeah,
help. But
so it's like, what is, if you were to categorize your worldview and like what you believe, how would you do that?
yeah.
and then start looking and researching, do you agree with, do you not agree with how that category answers
Yeah.
these questions?
Or one question I would even say is like, where in your life do you feel the most tension?
Yeah.
So do you feel the most tension around like, how do I trust things or trust what I know is true?
Like I have very low institutional trust. Like that's one of the things, like very low. And so it's like, and that's based on like a worldview of like believing that humans are not basically good.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's based off of like that fundamental principle that if humans are running it, it's probably not trustworthy.
Yeah. Or like where like if you feel tension in like the problems that you see in the world of like why is there so much suffering? And that's maybe a tension that you feel. We'll dig into like why even bother asking the question in the first place? If
So really it's like, what's the pain point you feel in your world around you?
yeah.
What's the thing that you think about the most already?
Because that will clue you into what you're believing about it.
Yeah.
Of like, if I feel the most tension around government issues, then I disagree somehow with the prevailing narrative of the day. How do I disagree with that? And then that can help inform, oh, I disagree with that in this regard. And I think it's because I believe, like you said with yours, it's because I believe man's not actually inherently good. So that's why I feel tension around that. Oh, and now you just figured out part of your ontology was, you have a supernatural ontology. You just figured out part of your axiology is that, well, it's definitely not humanistic because you don't fully trust people. Not that you don't think they're capable of doing good things.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think a good starting point this week is like, what is the pain point or the tension that you feel? And start digging into like, why? Why do I feel that way?
And I think the thing that's worth emphasizing is both Tara and I have spent hours and hours, possibly hundreds, like Tara definitely hundreds, if not up to 1,000+ hours based on your school. And like you literally wrote papers around this topic, like 20+ page paper, like big papers around this topic. And I've like gone through different courses and it's something that has been talked about in my family growing up. So it's like, I've been exposed to this idea of worldview a lot and we both have. And so we've spent a lot of time thinking about this and we've talked about it. And so if this
And we both naturally think in terms of framework.
Yeah.
Like we're both like, what's the rhythm? What's the structure?
Well, and I would say even partially because we were exposed to this in a young age. Like it's like chicken or egg, I don't know, for sure.
I think to your point, like where you're going is like it's taken years
Yes.
to like dig through and discuss. And I think we still see areas where I'm like, oh, how I'm acting doesn't line up with what I say I believe.
Yes, that is I think a big thing is like and a huge way to grow in self-awareness actually is to really dive into worldview.
Yeah.
If you say you believe something but then you act in opposition to that, then do you actually believe it? Because I would say like
because your actions are determined by your beliefs.
We've talked about that before on this podcast. Like I think it was like what do you actually want? That's the second episode of this podcast. We talked about this and it's basically the idea of like we will do what we want to do based on our beliefs.
Yeah.
And this is this worldview is where that comes from.
Right. Well, and the beneficial thing of a worldview is it helps you know what you believe and why you believe it.
Yeah. You can actually put language to it. But yeah, so I say that to say like, as you start this process, and I encourage you to start this process, like it is worth it to dive into this.
Because if you don't, it leads to confusion and it leads to tension, like we're talking about, of like, how do you know where you're not living in step with this? You have tension and it leads to incoherence and stress.
Well, and when everything is going wrong around you and you're like, I'm so stressed, everything is going like bad, it gives you a first step forward.
Yeah.
Like it helps you know what's the next step. Like it helps you determine what to do. Like we talked about at the beginning of our conversation.
Yeah.
And so lean in, work hard on this. Because this is something that we talk about like forging resilience, nurturing growth, embracing responsibility. This is all of those things.
Yeah.
I think the most practical application of it is the resiliency side of like, that's where you'll see things coming out.
Right. And that's how you know if it's strong or not.
Yeah.
Is your lack of resilience as well.
Yeah. And so it's like, that's where we see it play out. But it's like, you have to like nurture growth, which takes time. And you have to forge that resilience, which means you actually have to go through hard things to do that.
And you have to do the intellectual work of figuring this out too.
So you really have to embrace that I want to be responsible for what I believe.
Yeah.
Because that's actually, I think that can like wraps it up pretty well as far as if you want to be like somebody who lives the well-prepared life, you are choosing to be responsible for how you behave, what you believe, and what you do.
Yeah.
And you cannot do that if you don't know.
No, you can't.
Like if you don't know what you believe,
then you're at the whims of whatever you feel or
and so if you want to be responsible, you got to know what you believe. And so that's my challenge to you is really invest in this, learn what you believe and be able to put words to it. Have these conversations with people in your life.
Yeah.
It's so much easier to like, honestly, I think discovering worldview is so much easier when you're talking with people than just trying to do it by yourself.
Yeah, and that's where it comes out. You're like, oh, I disagree with you on this.
Yeah.
I wonder why.
And be like, have civil conversations with people and be able to talk about these things. Have those hard conversations, and work through it. And I think your life will be better for it, and you'll be more prepared for what the world throws at you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us on this episode of The Well Prepared Life.